Our phones are now the centre of our lives. They track our every move, our every call.
Police emergency.
And for police, they have become the key to solving crimes. This series is about the unique calls that cracked open Australia's most shocking murder cases.
It's taking a sinister turn.
Voices from beyond the grave.
He's got blood everywhere.
Calls you've never heard before.
You might have been shot.
The amazing stories of how today's telephone calls brought Australia's most horrific murderers to justice.
It's horrible.
I'm just wondering if you have any positions vacant at the moment.
What do you look like?
Okay, I'm around about 5'10", athletic build, around about a 6-inch cot.
This phone call was made by a killer. A murderer with a chilling disregard for life.
The massive ego. He was smarter than everyone else in the world.
A psychopath who killed for thrills.
I thought there was a crazy person out there.
Tonight, the violent double murders of single man Stephen Dempsey.
Stephen was just an incredible sort of person. He was very kind.
And father of 7, taxi driver Ezzedine Barmad.
I was petrified when I learnt what he did to my dad.
2 ruthless and seemingly disconnected murders.
The only thing that was really left was this notion of lust.
Linked together and solved by a few vital phone calls.
Hi, I'm just calling from St Vincent's Hospital. We've just had 2 patients present with knife wounds and cuts.
Friday, the 5th of August, 1994. Peter Rolfe made a phone call that began a dark chapter in Sydney's idyllic northern beaches.
I'm calling to report my friend Stephen Dempsey, who is missing.
Peter Rolfe was Stephen Dempsey's business partner. The two had known each other for 16 years and ran a landscaping company together.
Stephen was just an incredible sort of person. He was very generous, very kind, fearless sort of person.
The last time Peter saw the 34-year-old was during lunch at a job on Sydney's lower North Shore. He told Peter he was going out that night, but he didn't turn up the next day or to the house he shared with his sister.
Then on the Friday, when he hadn't turned up, I panicked. And I rang his sister and told her that I was going to ring the police.
He's been missing for 3 days. He lives at Palm Beach and he is gay.
Stephen was very open about his sexuality, but few knew about the one place he would often visit, Deep Creek, a popular gay beat. Deep Creek, significantly, was halfway between where Stephen had been working at Neutral Bay and his home in Palm Beach. And because Peter knew his friend cruised for casual sex, he took a detour there on his way to meet the police.
As I was heading down the Wakehurst Parkways past Deep Creek, I remember that Stephen used to frequent down there. So I drove in and there was his car parked there.
So Peter immediately alerted the police.
When we got to the Deep Creek Reserve, we gained access to the vehicle and there were a number of items inside the vehicle. But importantly, there was a used food container. The actual wrapping of that container was dated the 2nd of August. That was the last time Stephen Dempsey had been seen.
Which went some way to confirming how long the vehicle had been parked there.
When police searched the area, there was no sign of Stephen. His bank account hadn't been touched and he hadn't made any calls to family or friends.
As we know, a lot of people go missing day to day, and it's a very sad thing that people do disappear. A lot of the time that's the person's wishes. They wish to disappear and not be found. But we're pretty confident that that wasn't the case with Stephen.
There were no relationship issues. There was no issues of depression or anything like that, which might suggest he might harm himself. From all accounts, he seemed a fairly happy and content individual.
So, with no reason for Stephen to deliberately disappear, the detectives looked at motives for murder.
There are three motives that we speak about: greed, lust and revenge. Mr. Dempsey came from fairly modest surroundings economically. He didn't have any enemies that we knew of. So the notions of revenge or greed never really came to anything in the inquiry. The only thing that was really left from a homicide perspective was this notion of lust. And as he'd gone to a gay beat, perhaps he'd met someone there and something had gone wrong. But at this stage, we didn't have a body. We didn't, in fact, know if he was even dead. We didn't even have a crime scene. So a lot of it was still very, very mysterious.
Stephen Dempsey was last seen alive by a workmate on Tuesday. Police found his abandoned car at a Narrabeen reserve.
We would be seeking the assistance of people who frequent the reserve at Narrabeen. I'm sure a lot of people would have been there and seen this motor vehicle there over the last couple of days.
I take my dogs walking down the Deep Creek nearly every day, and last Thursday the dogs were playing in the creek and they came out with a boot. I also found some sunnies down there as well.
Thursday was the 4th of August, 2 days after Stephen had gone missing.
There are interesting things to find, but very importantly, the family were able to identify the boot and the sunglasses as having belonged to Stephen.
The fact that those items were recovered was fairly strong evidence that he had met with some form of foul play, and that we were looking at more than just a case of a missing person who didn't want to be found.
As a result, the search went into the murky waters of Deep Creek.
Given the fact that we couldn't find a body, we couldn't establish a crime scene, the creek was a very, very obvious area to search, and the best people to conduct that search were the police divers.
What they found was a potential murder weapon.
On about the second or third day of the search, police divers found a compound bow, a camouflage compound bow, with a quiver of arrows attached to it.
But, as yet, the detectives had no idea how central it was to the case and how it fitted into their puzzle.
Clearly something was amiss, but the frustrating part was trying to form the rest of that picture. What had actually happened to him? At that particular point of the investigation, there wasn't a lot of information that we had to work with. There were no markers to indicate that anyone known to him had been involved in his disappearance. So from that point of view, it was quite a difficult investigation.
Now, 3.5 months later, the calm of the northern beaches in Sydney was shattered again, as another family lost a loved one. 42-year-old Ezzedine Barmad was a devoted husband and father of 7 children, and he failed to come home after his night shift as a taxi driver.
At about 4 or 5 in the morning, my mum called the taxi base. I remember waking up hearing her speaking to someone, asking where her husband is. And that made me jump out of bed. That's when I could see on her face that something was wrong. She said, "Your dad's not home yet." And we knew that was unusual because he got home at 3:30 in the morning. Why wasn't he home? So there was a sense of fear and panic and worry about what has happened to him. Why isn't he home yet? He's never late. And at one point, She was placed on hold, and while she was on hold, she heard a taxi radio call through that said one of their taxi drivers had been killed, and it actually said how he was found. She screamed and she ran to tell my brother that Dad has been killed.
Thank you and good morning. A murder investigation is underway in Sydney after a taxi driver was found stabbed to death in the city's north. Police found the man inside his cab in the suburb of Collaroy after his wife reported him missing at around 5:30 this morning.
As we arrived, the uniformed police were there. They'd established a crime scene perimeter. Within that perimeter, a taxi cab was parked at an angle to the curb. The door was open. There was an extensive amount of blood. This was a very violent, vicious and bloody murder.
What police didn't know yet was that Ezzeddin's brutal murder was directly linked to the Stephen Dempsey investigation, and the blood found in the car would be key.
Following the autopsy, we knew that Ezzeddin Barmad had been stabbed some 37 times. His throat had been cut, and the cause of death was a stab to the heart.
There was evidence of blood spatters in the front of the taxi, but importantly, it was also observed that there were blood spatters in the rear of the taxi.
Obviously, that's an extremely important focus because in a violent encounter, there's always the prospect that the offender would also be injured.
Amongst the blood-soaked taxi, one smear on the steering wheel that was a slightly different colour from the rest caught the forensic team's attention.
Upon further investigation, it was actually revealed that that smear contained two blood types. One blood type was that of the deceased, Ezzeddin Barmad, but the second blood type was from an unknown person.
Then, 2 streets away, the police found the keys to the taxi.
There was blood found on the tag of those ignition keys, and there was also a palm print discovered embedded into the blood on that particular tag.
That blood was a third blood type, so police were potentially looking for 2 killers. But who were they? And why was the 42-year-old father of 7 the victim of such a gruesome murder?
Was it a drug-fueled frenzied attack? Was it a cold, targeted murder? Was it an alcohol situation where things got out of hand, resulting in the death of a person?
An obvious motive to examine in the first instance is robbery. However, the fact that we recovered some $276 in cash on the person of Ezzeddin Barmad led us to believe at that particular point that robbery probably wasn't a motive for this offence.
So after we discounted robbery as being a motive, we looked at the victim himself, Ezzeddin Barmad.
Dad was born in Lebanon. He moved to Australia for a better life. The way I would describe him is that he was a gentle soul. He was so kind and so considerate, and he really loved being around people. But his biggest passion was his family.
Diane was only 14 years old when her loving dad was brutally taken away from her and her 6 siblings.
There are some memories that I have of him when we were kids. We would wake up in the morning and find a chocolate bar near our beds because he'd picked some up at the service station on his way home and, delivered one to each child as a surprise. So, we didn't have much money, but he always did his best to not allow us to see it by giving us things that we wanted.
Diane's father's brave struggle for life in the back streets of Collaroy was only a 10-minute drive away from Deep Creek, where Stephen Dempsey had disappeared, presumed murdered. For such a quiet community, one murder was disturbing. 2 within 3 months of each other was unthinkable.
So you come back to this motive of lust. Both men appeared to have just been killed for the sake of killing them.
As the search for the murderer of Diane's beloved father continued,
I thought this was a monster. I thought there was a crazy person out there.
the investigation into the disappearance of Stephen Dempsey had gone completely cold. But then a phone call provided a shocking breakthrough.
Yeah, hi. Look, I've just come back from my morning walk down Towers Bay and I've seen something really weird in the water. You know, like is that skin or something? It might have been, I don't know, a torso or something.
We received a call at the office. A torso of a male had been washed up at the shore in Towers Bay Pittwater.
Freaked me out. I didn't know what to do. I had a closer look. It seemed to be wrapped in wire.
The torso had been quite meticulously wrapped in chicken wire with rocks attached, obviously in some attempt to weigh down the body. But obviously the torso had floated to the surface and been blown to Towers Bay.
The torso had been found at a spot in Pittwater, only 40 minutes away from Deep Creek, where Stephen Dempsey's car had been found 5 months before.
Looking at the torso, it was the torso of a person, I thought at the time, who was in the prime of their life. The person had obviously been very tall, and it reminded me a little bit in terms of the shape of Stephen Dempsey in photographs. But the state of decomposition of the torso was such that clearly, in my experience anyway, that body hadn't been in the water for 5 months if it was going to be Mr. Dempsey.
The remains were taken to the morgue.
There, the wire was removed from the body. There was a large wound that was evidence to the chest, and when we explored further, we found an arrowhead embedded in the torso's heart.
It was the same type of arrowhead that police divers had recovered in Deep Creek 5 months before.
Recovering the arrowhead was obviously a real turning point.
The arrowhead was so perfectly embedded in the heart, it suggested the killer was a skilled hunter. And his expertise didn't stop there.
The pathologist noted that the dismembering had occurred with a great deal of precision. He thought that whoever had done that dismember had medical training, or they'd perhaps worked at an abattoir or a butchery to have done the job as neatly as they had.
But what was puzzling was the state of the decomposition of the torso.
The opinion of the forensic pathologists was that the body had suffered about 3.5 weeks worth of decomposition. Now, clearly that didn't tally with the length of time that Stephen Dempsey had been missing for.
So something had happened to that torso in the interim. It hadn't been out in the open. It had been secreted somewhere or hidden. The pathologist was of the view that the body had been kept in cold storage or something similar to preserve it.
When the DNA results came back from the tiniest of blood found in the victim's heart, the detective's hunch was confirmed. The torso was that of Stephen Dempsey.
We were relieved in a way. At least we knew what had happened to him. We'd gone through 5 months of worrying and wondering what on earth had happened to him. But at the same time, we were just horrified.
But what Peter and the general public were unaware of at that time was exactly how Stephen had died.
That was deliberately withheld because clearly the only person that would know that information, if it hasn't been disclosed to the public, would be the person who's committed the offence.
For months there have been separate mysteries: the disappearance of Stephen Dempsey at a Narrabeen reserve and the discovery of a torso in Pittwater. But today, police have confirmed both are the same. It was a deep chest wound, possibly inflicted by a knife, which caused Mr. Dempsey's actual death. His body then dismembered in a morbid attempt to prevent identification. Anyone with information is asked to contact Mona Vale Police.
I'm calling about the guy that was murdered and went missing from Deep Creek.
Yes, what can you tell us?
Last year I was down there with a friend and we walked past this guy who had a bow and arrow, and when we walked past him I heard a noise and
turned around and I saw the guy, and he was aiming it straight at us, and we just jumped out of the way. And I grabbed a big stick and I walked up to him and asked, what are you doing? And he said he was just joking, and he walked off.
As we had not mentioned anything about bows and arrows in our media release, and we knew, of course, how Mr. Dempsey had died, their testimony was of particular interest to us.
And then there was more.
He was about 5'9", 5'10".
The caller's hobby and his eye for detail were a godsend for the detectives.
I've done some archery, and I noticed that the kind of arrowhead he was using was a broadhead arrow.
That was the same arrowhead that was recovered from Mr. Dempsey's torso, and it was also the same arrowhead that was on the arrows in the quiver that was attached to the bow we found at the bottom of Deep Creek.
It was an important bit of information because now we had someone walking through the reserve at Deep Creek in possession of a bow in the very area that Dempsey's reported missing.
The detectives were a step closer to their prey, but they still didn't have a name to put to the killer. So they made a strategic decision to release the real truth about Stephen's death.
34-year-old Stephen Dempsey's torso was found floating in Pittwater last December. Today it was revealed he'd been shot through the heart with an arrow.
On this occasion, in very, very quick time, we received about 122 different telephone calls concerning people with bows and arrows in the Deep Creek area.
So one of the calls was from a local bushwalker that had been in the Deep Creek Reserve and had crossed paths with a man that was described as having a bow in that area. I think words were exchanged.
He said words to the effect of, watch out down there, there's a couple of, to use his words, or that person's words, a couple of poofters down the track. Another critical call that came in off the back of that press release was the fact that a kayaker who had been kayaking along Deep Creek had actually seen a male person on the shore with a compound bow.
I saw a guy in the bushes with a bow and arrow pointing it at me. I paddled faster to get away, but he just kept aiming it at me, following me, and then he fired an arrow right in front of me.
Of those 122 phone calls, 5 mentioned the same person.
Richard Leonard, who was someone that had been known to frequent the Deep Creek Reserve, that was known to have gone hunting fish with a compound bow.
Who happened to be 5 foot 10 inches tall and used to be an abattoir worker.
So clearly at that point in time, he became a real focus of the investigation.
But when detectives learnt about another phone call made 4 months before, the investigation took a completely new turn.
Hi, I'm just calling from St Vincent's Hospital. We've just had 2 patients present with knife wounds and cuts. The male patient has a deep wound in the right side of his ribs.
Richard Leonard had been stabbed.
He claims he was attacked and stabbed by a group of Asians in a park.
Mr. Leonard presented himself at the hospital with a stab wound to the chest and a stab wound to his hand. His girlfriend, who was with him at the time, also had injuries consistent with a knife.
But when the local police turned up, Leonard and his girlfriend, Denise Shipley, told them the wounds were self-inflicted from an S&M session gone wrong.
So the matter was recorded but left at that point.
The report was now of huge significance. The time and date of the nurse's phone call was just a few hours after Ezzedine Barmad had been murdered 30 kilometres away.
We had checked all the local hospitals on the peninsula. There was nothing there to indicate anyone had presented with any stab wound that night. So in travelling that far away to get treatment, he certainly got outside the bounds of our initial inquiry.
Now, Leonard was well and truly inside their net. His name was linked to both murders.
During one of the visits from the detectives at our home, I remember that they broke the news that they were getting closer to the murderer because Dad fought really hard, and at some point during the struggle, Dad grabbed the knife from the murderer and he stabbed him back. And because he did that, the murderer obviously had to go to hospital for treatment. Pretty scary to think that that's what he went through. He would have been very scared for his life, but more scared for our lives if he was not going to be around. So I think that would have made him continue to fight for his life as much as he could in that particular moment.
So this is the first time that we make a tangible link between the two homicides, and that Richard Leonard and Denise Shipley may have been involved in both offences.
As a result, police were granted a search warrant at Richard Leonard's home.
Nothing of any great evidentiary value was found, but he agreed to accompany us to Manly Police Station, where we told him we wished to speak to him about the murder of Mr Dempsey and Mr Barnett.
Our intent at that particular point in time was to purely put the allegations to him. He was completely unfazed, unshaken, and came across as very calm, cool and collected.
Do you agree? I told you that we were making inquiries in relation to the death of a man by the name of Stephen Dempsey? Yes, that is correct. Do you agree? You told me you did not wish to say anything in terms of that matter? Yes, that is correct. Do you agree in other conversations we've had, you told me that you once had a bow and arrow when you were living at Celsius Street, Coleroy Plateau? Yes, that is correct. Do you also agree, you told me that the arrowheads you used were arrowheads called bodkins? Bodkin. Have you ever used broadheads? Not at all.
Leonard was so arrogant that he thought he could fool the detectives, but they weren't buying it. When they'd visited the house Leonard said he used to live in at Coleroy Plateau, they had spoken to his ex-neighbour.
He would often observe Richard with a compound bow in hand, and he would fire hunting arrows at the large tree that was in the backyard of that house. And when the scientific police inspected that tree, they actually recovered a broadhead arrow from the tree trunk,
which was exactly the same type of arrowhead that had been removed from Mr Dempsey's torso.
It was an amazing find, but the detectives needed a lot more to put the evil double murderer of Stephen Dempsey and Ezzardine Barmad behind bars.
Do you also agree that today you have provided us with samples of your hair and a blood sample? Yes, that is correct.
Detectives were convinced his blood would match the blood sample found at the Ezzardine Barmad murder. They just had to be patient.
After Mr Leonard gave his blood sample, I told him we would have the results from the DNA analysis back within 1 week.
And Leonard continued to be cocky.
Do I have to find my own way home, or can I get a lift or something? Give you a lift. The time is now 3:18 p.m.
But before the results came back, Detective Lynch received a phone call that was totally unexpected.
I rang up earlier today. They said you weren't there, and I said it was urgent that I needed to speak to you.
6 days after the interview, I received a call from Richard Leonard asking that we come down to the Christian City Church in Sydenham Street, Brookvale, where he was waiting with his girlfriend Denise, and they wanted to speak to us.
It was the day before the blood test results were due back.
Both Richard Leonard and Denise Shipley presented themselves to the local pastor and confessed that they'd both been involved in the murder of Stephen Dempsey and the murder of Ezzardine Barmad.
Aside from his shaved head, which was part, he said, of a cleansing, tell-all ritual that he'd been through, one of the most appreciable differences I saw in Mr Leonard when I met him on that second occasion at the church was that his demeanour had changed almost completely. He'd gone from very controlling to very contrite in a short period of time.
But his repentance was not an apology.
I understood what he was doing when he was doing it because the next day he was going to be wanted. It was a perfectly logical thing to do because the ego, the massive ego that he had, he was smarter than everyone else in the world. I don't think his ego would have been capable of putting up or living with the notion that the police had actually caught him.
So Richard Leonard and his girlfriend Denise Shipley were arrested and brought back to the police station for a long night of questioning.
In relation to the murder of Ezzeldine Barnett, Mr. Leonard said that he and his girlfriend had gone to the city that night.
We had what's called a brown microdot, which is a form of LSD.
They'd walked around the place and then decided to catch a cab home.
I only had enough money to catch a bus back, but Denise really wanted to get a taxi.
I was too paranoid to catch a bus, so we decided to catch a cab. To call a road better and to jump out there and just run away.
So we got into this cab and the driver was, what's his name?
The driver's name was Mr. Ezzeldine Barnett.
Ezzeldine Barnett.
Yes.
So the driver was Ezzeldine Barnett. Denise got into the front passenger seat and I got into the back. He said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, we want to go to Colorado Player." We pulled up in 4th Street and he told us the price of the fare. And so I pulled out my knife from the inside pocket of my jacket and put the point of the knife to the driver's neck and said, "Don't move." At the time I said, "Don't move," he grabbed the knife out of my hand and then everything went completely insane.
I was spinning out and he was trying to turn around and he was jabbing with both of his hands and he had the knife in one hand.
Who had held the knife?
The taxi driver. Hands everywhere. Screams and yells and runs.
Who was making those noises?
Both of them and me.
I went over the top of the seat. I tried to get the knife off him and I got stabbed in the chest through my jacket.
By Mr. Barnett.
By Mr. Barnett.
But Leonard wrestled back the knife.
Open the door.
Who had hold of the knife?
Richard.
And what was Richard doing with the knife?
Stabbing him.
Can you tell me where he was stabbing him?
In the chest.
My knife was very sharp. So I had a steel that I used and I always had knife sharp. It was my favourite knife.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually cost me $90, that knife. And you could get a tomato and slice it like a razor blade. It was really good.
And Richard held his head, cut his throat.
It would have been 2 or 3 sweeps, something like that. It went through very easily.
What happened then?
And as I was getting out, Denise came in and she took the keys out of the ignition because the engine was still running. And I said, "Run."
Mm-hmm. Having killed Mr. Barnett, Mr. Leonard and his girlfriend Shipley ran down the road. There they decided to discard the keys and they went to a nearby public toilet, looked themselves over. They realised Mr. Leonard was quite seriously hurt and both of them had cuts.
He said he had pains in his chest and cut in his chest.
They tidied themselves up, walked home, got in a car and then made the decision to drive to a hospital that was some distance away in order that they could have their injuries treated.
It was there Leonard told a nurse he'd been stabbed by a group of Asians. And believing he was a victim of crime, she rang the police and Richard Leonard's name was recorded forevermore.
I was petrified when I learnt what he did to my dad. So to then learn what he's done to another man. How does a person like that exist?
But while her dad's evil killer admitted to murdering her father, he told detectives the killing of 34-year-old Stephen Dempsey was self-defence.
All right, so you've gone into the cave there. You've seen Mr. Dempsey urinating. He smiled at you. You've come outside. What did you do then?
And he came out and he stood over here, and he said he was like the guy's dick. And I said, no, I picked up my bow and I pointed at him and I said, don't come over here, I'm going to shoot him. And he said, I don't believe you. And then he said, I'm going to walk towards you now.
Mr. Leonard put forward a defence, basically that he'd been outraged and frightened from a homosexual advance that he'd received from Mr. Dempsey.
I didn't want him to come any closer to me. I felt threatened.
But that defence of provocation was blown right out of the water because the police had one very important piece of evidence, a phone call that Leonard had made to a male brothel.
Alexander, can I help you? Yes, hello, my name is Richard. I'm just wondering if you have any positions vacant at the moment. Yeah, we're always looking for people. Have you worked before? No, I haven't actually. Do you realise it's male to male, most of our work? I do realise, yes. Right, okay, well, the guys ring up and think it's male to female. What do you look like? Okay, I'm around about 5'10". Athletic build. Right. Around about a 6-inch cock. What else could I tell you? Are you smooth or hairy? Smooth. When can you come in for an interview?
The afternoon of that call, police saw Leonard head to the brothel and leave an hour later.
So we knew that the feigned outrage that he was showing with regards to a homosexual advance that he'd received from Dempsey really didn't weigh up to be too much.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Richard, we'll speak to you then. Okay, bye.
I let go of the string and the arrow went into him. And then I realised that this guy's dead.
Mr. Leonard told us that he removed the shaft from the arrow.
And then I picked up my bow and I threw it into the water.
And then rolled the body into Deep Creek, where he left it. And then, of all things, he went to his mother's birthday party.
After celebrating with his family, he returned and removed Stephen's body from the creek and callously dismembered it.
And I cut around the leg, and then I cut up into the joint. I don't think, unless I worked in an abattoir, I don't think I would have been able to do what I did.
Leonard then took the body parts home and put them into his fridge, which he later revealed to his girlfriend.
I said, there is a person in the fridge. Right.
I said, there's a man in the fridge.
What did you say to that?
I didn't say much for a while.
Yeah, she was quite shocked.
Did you believe that Stephen Dempsey's body was in that refrigerator?
The first reaction of one in that situation would be to notify police. But she conceals the fact that those body parts are in the fridge. She knew they were there, and she continued on as if life was normal. But I certainly do think that she was under somewhat of a spell, captivated and driven by Leonard at the time.
Whose idea was it to remove the body from the refrigerator?
I should see he wanted to get rid of it.
Why did he want to get rid of the body?
He said he was paranoid because of what happened that night with the cab driver.
I got to go for a walk, and I carried two parcels in sheets down and put them into the boat with wire ties and a pair of pliers.
And what were those two parcels you're referring to?
They were the remains of Mr. Dempsey.
He then left Denise Shipley on the shore and he motored out into the middle of Pittwater and disposed of Stephen Dempsey's remains in the water, obviously in the hope that they'd never be discovered.
3 weeks later, they were.
I've seen something really weird in the water. It might have been, I don't know, a torso or something.
That call sparked a chain reaction of other vitally crucial phone calls.
He was about 5'9", 5'10".
Which led to Richard Leonard's name, and the police then knowing he had gone to a hospital on the other side of town suffering a stab wound.
The male patient has a deep wound in the right side of his ribs.
That call was very fortuitous for the inquiry. From that, we were able to link his involvement in both murders quite quickly from a single piece of evidence.
Sydney double murderer Richard Leonard has been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail.
Psychiatrist Bruce Westmore said there was no doubt Leonard was a psychopath. The only known cure was hope. Outside, the families of both victims comforted each other.
I'm very happy for this sentence, yeah. I love to see him, suffer, like us, like the children he left behind.
The murderer actually pled guilty to killing my dad. So the trial that we attended was the trial for the murder of Stephen Dempsey. I remember hearing evidence that he showed his girlfriend the body of Stephen, and she didn't run away. She stayed there. That was before my dad died. And so that's why I just...
Had Denise Shipley spoken up, Leonard would have been under arrest. He would not have caught Diane's father's taxi that night, and her father would still be alive.
There was another person in the car that day. There was another person who contributed to my dad's murder. She only got 8 years.
Denise Shipley pleaded guilty and was convicted of being an accessory after the fact for both murders. She has served her time. Richard Leonard will stay behind bars for the rest of his life, never to be released.
On the day that Dad died, before that, our life was pretty amazing. We were happy, we were close, we did everything together. And the day he died, the world stopped and shifted and everything changed. It's like the world changed on that day.